of the India-Oxford Initiative at the University of Oxford, I'd like to give you a really warm welcome to this virtual event. Under the current shared and evolving global conditions, it is perhaps more important today to note the role of philanthropy in supporting and ensuring that the University of Oxford continues to play a global role in academia, and staff and students are able to realize their full potential in all fields. From scholarships, teaching, research, and museum collections, philanthropy has indeed had a real impact across our university. The role of philanthropists arguably will become even more important to the arts as corporate and government support comes under pressure, not just in the UK, but across the world within cultural and academic institutes. Today, we are delighted to have with us distinguished guests who understand philanthropy and the arts, especially on the Indian subcontinent. One cannot think of the art establishment on the subcontinent without Lekha Poddar, who, along with her son Anupam, is the founder of Devi Art Foundation. Lekha's interest in collecting and support of the visual arts extends to cultural diplomacy, and indeed, her foundation focuses not just on and in India, but far beyond its borders. Anders Petterson, who previously worked for JP Morgan Investment Bank, is the founder of Art Tactic, an art market research and education company. And his recent reports are on philanthropy in India 2019 and philanthropy in South Asia 2020. Robert Easton is a veteran partner and senior advisor to Carlyle, the global alternative asset management firm, and a past chairman of the British Venture Capital Association, the UK trade body for private equity and venture capital. For 3 years, until October 2020, just last month, Robert was also our Pro Vice Chancellor for Development and External Affairs at the University of Oxford, and he remains on a number of university committees and boards as an external representative. It is a privilege to be opening in such exceptional company and an honor to introduce our speakers and handing over to Robert to chair for subsequent discussion. My name is Mallica Kumbera Landrus, and I am chair of the India-Oxford Initiative, keeper of the Eastern Art Department, fellow of St. Cross College, associate professor and senior curator of Indian art at the Ashmolean Museum in the University of Oxford. Although we are not able to physically meet in Oxford, these webinars have given us the opportunity to welcome many more of you than we could have possibly fit into a single lecture theatre. Oxford has long-standing connections with the subcontinent, the earliest recorded to 1579. The first student from the region arrived in Oxford in 1871. This year, we have nearly 600 students from South Asia and over 200 academic-related staff. Of these, India is represented by 412 students and 172 members of staff. In response to demand for greater collaboration across the university on India, the India-Oxford Initiative was created 2 years ago as a mechanism to build and sustain partnerships between individuals and institutions in India and academics and researchers at the University of Oxford. It acts as a hub to coordinate India-related activities across the university and as a contact point for potential external partners. Within Oxford, the initiative aims to attract participants from around the university and includes representatives from all divisions, which at Oxford means medicine, mathematical, physical and life sciences, social sciences, humanities, and the university collections. Indeed, the initiative is an excellent example of how colleagues from across the university, irrespective of our disciplines, have come together with the aim of achieving an impact that is greater than the sum of our parts. The initiative seeks to develop equitable partnerships with organizations and institutions, leading to collaborative academic research of mutual benefit. We particularly look to support students and early career researchers develop successful collaborations across all disciplines. In the arts, more specifically, there is great interest in supporting curatorial fellowships, artist residencies, student internships, and collection management expertise. As a reminder, we are live streaming and the video will subsequently be available on our website. Welcome again to all our audiences, both national and international. And now I have the great pleasure of handing over to Robert.
Good, Mallica. Well, thank you very much and welcome everybody. So I'm Robert Easton, and until recently I ran as part of my portfolio at the university all of development, which is a jargon for fundraising, philanthropic fundraising at the university. And to scale that for you, last year we did about 300 million of fundraising, and the year before that about 400 million, and that's pounds. So very, very substantial numbers. And in a UK context, that's typically between 30 and 40% of all of philanthropic giving to higher education in the UK comes to Oxford University. That's the sort of the scale of the brand. As part of that funding, the museums and the collections around the university, which are precious and incredibly important to us, attract a tremendous amount of philanthropic funding. And of course, we do already attract a lot of funding, but we need more. And we've got two fantastic speakers with us today who are going to talk about Indian art and about Indian art and philanthropy. So I'm going to hand over, and the basic format is we're going to have two quite short 5-minute presentations, first of all from Anders and then from Lekha, and then we're going to go and have a sort of Q&A session, which I'll chair, and at some point during that session we'll open it up to questions from the wider group. So I'm going to hand over to Anders now, and then Anders will hand over to Lekha, and then we'll come back and have a little bit of a live debate in front of you, if that's okay. So Anders, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. I wanted to kind of take you a little bit through our journey. So I'm the managing director and founder of Art Tactic, and we've been doing research since 2001. And our journey into the, particularly in the South, Indian art market was started in 2005. And has ultimately has changed over the years, and I'll take you a little bit through that journey, but has accumulated into two kind of two reports or an initiative, which is around art and philanthropy. And I'll share, hopefully during the discussion later on, some of the kind of the insights and the findings of this report, but it's given us a kind of a slightly different perspective. So if I can have the next slide, please. So I guess the question is, how did we start? So we entered into the Indian, I guess, context through the market side. So looking at what was happening in the sort of bit around 2004 and 2005, and we started to monitor the market, and we're still monitoring the market. But the emphasis of our research has sort of changed, particularly since the financial crisis in 2009. Which in a sense exposed many of the vulnerabilities of the Indian art market, but the South Asian art market as a whole. And part of the vulnerability was hitting the contemporary living artists, which up until 2008 was having quite a good run in terms of auctions, but the auction market after the financial crisis had a significantly negatively impacted, and it impacted also the ability for contemporary artists to find a market outside auction. So we started to ask the question, what happened, after the financial crisis? What was the vehicles and what was the platforms that was built to try to support contemporary practice and contemporary artists? So 2-3 years ago, we went back and said, well, it's not that interesting now to look at auction data to try to understand what's happening in the market, because there's such a small, tiny percent, about 5% of the transactions are contemporary art. Most of it is modern and more established artists. So we took a slightly different view and started to look at the evolution of non-for-profit arts organizations, and in different formats, in different forms from 2009 till about 2019, and found an undergrowth of grassroots initiatives, foundations, artist residencies, artist-led projects, collector-driven projects, an amazing amount of activity, including public projects like biennials that was coming up in various parts of South Asia. After that was basically a report we did in about 2017, and then the question came, how is this sector supported? Where is the income sources coming from? So if I could have the next slide, please. And that led us to basically the two last reports that you saw when we started. There was a need for us when we started the research is to try to get a sense of the landscape. And we spent considerable time for the first edition of the report to do a sector mapping, where we were looking at and identifying all the various initiatives that was happening across the region in order to try to first of all understand the diversity of the initiatives, and also then initially the second report was to try to understand the funding sources. Maybe something we to talk about a little bit later on. I mean, the lack of data has been is problematic. It's something that is, I think, anyone in the arts and cultural sector is struggling with. Is to, how do we measure the value of art? What is the real value of art? I mean, and the same issue we came across in India was to try to establish, how do we articulate all these initiatives? And we found the best ways for us was looking at best practice, looking at models, looking at storytelling rather than actually coming up with, a set of figures that, would be very hard to get in the first place. And the other thing it allowed us was to have conversations with people in India and the wider South Asian region to establish conversations so that we could start to gradually harvest insight and data from these individuals. And this is something that we started this year actually, a survey among arts organizations and non-for-profit organizations that is in our report. If I could have the next slide, please. So the report is really looking at, I guess, three, or particularly two. The two first models is around individual art philanthropy. Within that, we have different forms. We're looking at corporate philanthropy and also some of the issues regarding international giving, which is also something that we might touch upon in other conversations later on. But we really, I guess, are interested in the space around art patronage and art philanthropy is to look at both the kind of existing models, best practices, and not only in the South Asian, we also do it in the Middle East. We're looking at Africa, and we're looking at other examples in the Western world. What is the appropriate models for supporting arts and different types of initiatives? And there are some very interesting things that is happening in different parts of the world. And I think part of, for us to try to kind of, I guess, develop these reports or these type of research projects is to start to share these practices across different, these are not, some of them might be local and might have a cultural context, but others are applicable to any parts of the world. And the other thing we are, I guess, looking at closely is how the next generation of patrons, philanthropists, how they think about the future and what kind of models we can develop to try to engage these individuals in supporting the art and cultural sector going forward. So that's just a kind of a little bit, as I said, if I was to share the findings, will take me probably several days. But hopefully some of these things I can touch upon in the conversation with Robert and Lekha a little bit later on. So I think that's it for me.
Hi, shall I start, Robert?
Yeah, sorry, Lekha. Yeah, thank you very much, Anders, and thank you for actually trying to solve the problem of data gathering in such a difficult sector. But yes, Lekha, over to you.
Okay, so I just want to start by saying that, like many people, I did not start out as a collector. I was plain lucky that I had a few great mentors who really held my hand through my journey of art. And this started around the 1980s. In late 1990s, when my younger son, Anupam, returned to Delhi after finishing his studies in the UK, he met a few artists his age. We had just moved into a new home, which you're seeing in the picture, and he wanted to do up his apartment, which was on the first floor, with art that he had bought from his artist friends. Here on, we started our journey of collection, which is not only contemporary art from India, but also from the Indian subcontinent and Iran. By 2005, we realized that what we had collected was important. And thus, Devi Art Foundation, a not-for-profit organization, was born. It was given a platform. It was to give platform to artists from the region engaged in cutting-edge and experimental art, and also to give curators and critics a voice. We were lucky to get 750 square meters of space in this building, which was my husband's office, which was just outside of Delhi. So I just want to run briefly through what we have done over the past few years. We've had about 17 exhibitions. I'm just going to show a few examples of what we've done. Most of them have been curated by non-curators, if I may use that word. In 2008, we had our first exhibition called The Still Moving Images. It was curated by Diksha Nath, who was 26 or 27 years old. She had just graduated from Goldsmiths College, London. And this exhibition was one of the first exhibitions of its kind to focus on video art and contemporary photography from India. The Foundation's second exhibition was a collaboration with the faculty and students of Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. The students were to study curation for a whole semester. So we from the Foundation suggested that they take a practical course. We opened our entire collection to them for research and curation. And this culminated in an exhibition called Where in the World, which was about the impact of globalization and economic liberalization on contemporary art in India. For the show, for the next show, for not the next show, but for another show called Resemble, Reassemble, which we had in 10, Rashid Rana, a leading contemporary artist of Pakistan, curated a show of 45 young Pakistani artists from our collection. Vernacular in the Contemporary was a 3-year research and residency project undertaken by art historian Dr. Annapurna Garimali. 75 vernacular artists were commissioned to make new works, not in their traditional style, but in a contemporary context. These were shown over 2 exhibitions that lasted a year. Homespun, an exhibition, was curated by an art critic and writer from India called Girish Shahane. The theme of the exhibition was a spin on the idea of home. The next exhibition I'm going to talk about is an exhibition from Iran. So the graphic artist and curator Amir Ali Ghasami curated this exhibition called Elephant in the Dark. And this is from our collection of young Iranian artists who were obviously expressing their socio-political concerns of their time. Sunnata Samanta, which means emptiness and equality, was our last exhibition earlier this year, just before the world shut down. It was an exhibition curated by a writer and a publisher called S. Anand. He deals with anti-caste issues in India. Reaching out to the community, especially to the young minds, has always been a priority for Devi Art Foundation. With most of our exhibitions, students of schools, colleges are encouraged to visit and to query. Since 2015, we have been actively working to engage with younger people through our educational programs. And these programs are carefully designed by young art educators using our collection as a resource. We have been collaborating with the Ashoka University, which is the first liberal arts college just on the outskirts of Delhi. Over the past couple of years, the university has initiated a program called the Experiential Learning Module. And for this program, Young India Fellows of the university engage with our collection, which ends in an exhibition curated by the students. And it is open to the rest of the university. So about 700 students visit the exhibition in the course of 10 days. Similar initiatives are undertaken with other universities too. At the Aurobindo Center of Arts and Communications, the foundation invites artist photographers to interact with students in a lecture series called the Library Sessions. Our most satisfying educational program is with an organization called Art Reach India. Along with them, we create art rooms which happen throughout the year, engaging students above the age of 15 years from care homes and orphanages around Delhi. We usually get between 30 to 40 students, and some activities undertaken are showing shadow puppeting, theater, photography, narrative drawings, This is a year-long program, and it also ends in an exhibition, which is curated by the students. So this is a very brief sketch that I've given you people just to get an idea of the social philanthropy programs that we have undertaken at Devi Art Foundation. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Lekha. And I think straight away there are two themes coming out of those presentations. Out of Anders, you heard about the need for data and the frustration that there isn't data, easily accessible data available. And from Lekha, you heard the importance of young artists, promotion of young artists, and of working closely with students and allowing them to really find their mission in life. So my first question is actually around that second theme, which is what really appeals to philanthropists? Because remember, we're talking about philanthropy and the arts today. And we're trying to attract more money into the sector. I mean, that has to be an admirable aim. So what, and I'll put this to Lekha first, what attracts philanthropists most? So you've talked about community, you've talked about students and interfaces with the university, but there's also heritage, there's also the funding of galleries. There's also driving wider participation, not just within a community, but beyond that. And Mallica will of course say to me, there's also the basics of academia and getting the curation of these collections properly funded. So from your perspective, Lekha, what is it when you talk to philanthropists? And that list, by the way, might not be right, but what is it that really appeals to philanthropists in your experience?
I think art and heritage, culture, all of it is very underfunded in India. I think one of the main things is that, the education system doesn't give it any priority. And I do think that, I don't know, this is my thought that a lot of the industrialists have really made made that big money in the last 15, 20 years. So I think it's also a way of establishing, first of all, their own credentials. The government of India has got it. I think there is a 2% corporates. I think philanthropy, which they have to do 2% of profit, which they have to actually distribute. But one of the subjects in that is child education or underprivileged children. So a lot of money goes into that. And obviously, because heritage is not or culture or art or any such thing is not written into the guidelines of philanthropy, which the corporates have to distribute, it's really taken off the shelf.
So the trick from your perspective would be to find a way to change that little bit of legislation that says that
that would really help. Yes.
And that would be for corporates, and I get that. But for high net worths, for take a tech entrepreneur out of Bangalore who's made his billions in technology, and he might be quite young, so that's he's not going to be out of the great Indian families who have been industrialists for 100 years. So he's young, he's built his fortune, he's entrepreneurial. What do you think appeals to him in the arts from a philanthropy standpoint?
I'm just going to So a friend of mine and common friend of Anders and mine, he's opening a museum in Bangalore next weekend.
Okay.
Yeah, and he has got amazing. I mean, he is a brilliant fundraiser. He's got a huge over the years, he has managed to get some endowment for his museum. And he has got all these young tech people actually coming forward to say that, we will help you with whichever section is their speciality. So even if it is for underprivileged children or it is even for disabled people, the kind of tech that is required to be put into a museum to get that, the museum to be friendly with disabled people or with with whatever else is needed, for the lighting, for, I don't know, collection, photography, archiving, they're all coming forward. It's not
Sure.
as, that, these young people don't do, but I think it's, if they do it in a way where they will get, I guess some benefit of it, or they're doing it just as a philanthropical cause. But if we really want to make the cultural sector big in India, it needs support either from the government or from the corporate sector.
Yeah, got it. Okay, thank you. Anders, switching over to you. You said in your presentation how difficult it is to source reliable data, and that's kind of how you got into doing what you're doing in trying to source data. I noticed one data point which was incredibly interesting, and I just want to sort of probe a bit on the source of it and then what we might do about it, which is that 62% of the value over a certain number of years, I think it was 4 years, 62% of the value of Indian art traded was from just 25 artists. So in other words, huge concentration in the money flowing through the system on relatively few artists. So first of all, how did you actually manage to source that data point? Okay, it can't have been straightforward. And then secondly, actually for both of you, how do you move that percentage in a more favorable way? In other words, to have 62% accounted for by 200 artists, not 25. But first of all, how did you source the data point?
So the data here it's publicly available data using the auction, which a little bit the graph I described earlier on, which obviously doesn't reflect, again, the art market has certain non-transparent elements with like private private transactions, etc. But I think the public markets being auctions gives you sort of a sense, a kind of a snapshot of the wider picture, and this is not unique to the Indian context. Is actually now a kind of a global phenomenon that you have maybe 100 artists in the world that accounts for 60, 70, or I did number, I don't know exactly, but a very high percentage, which in a sense mimics a little bit the landscape of global wealth, where a very small percentage account for a very large part of the world's resources. Mm-hmm. In terms of the problems around this, in terms of the art market, is that, as you say, it channels a very large portion of this resources to very few artists, and probably artists that doesn't really need it, because many of them are no longer alive. They obviously, the fact that people support these artists means that they support the infrastructure in terms of the galleries and dealers and auction houses that lives off selling these artists. But what it doesn't do is to support the next generation, and doesn't act as a incubator and support mechanism for younger artists that's going to come through, hopefully, for the future. And that is really the focus of the research that we're providing, is this incredible, important non-for-profit grassroots initiatives that is, after the 2008 boom and subsequently sort of downturn in the market in 2009, contemporary artists was finding themselves, with galleries that couldn't sell their art. There was no auction market for them. But suddenly you started to see initiatives like the Kochi Biennale, for example, in Kerala, where you suddenly started to have other ways of supporting your practice. And I think this is if you take from a Western world, we are spoiled by having public institutions. We are spoiled by having, a broad, diverse commercial market. You have government funding. All of these things are something that the South Asian and Indian art market in many ways lacks. And therefore, it falls on, in this case, it's fallen on mostly private individuals to try to cultivate and support that incredibly important, as I said, a platform that is needed for kind of creating, instead of 25 artists, to have 2,000 artists that can make a living out of it. And I think this is a common problem that we now have in terms of how do we create some kind of almost like a redistribution mechanism that allows those who makes a lot, how can they support the next stage? Because if you don't, then you don't have the ladder effect that can ultimately push artists up the career trajectory. So I think the problem a little bit is that obviously the non-for-profit sector is generally underfunded, and I guess Lekha probably better than me, but I mean in India it's hard for it's hard for smaller organizations to survive, and obviously even harder now in the current climate, where resources are being channeled to more needy causes because of the pandemic, and it leaves that sector very vulnerable to the market as a whole, to the ecosystem, which I think is is incredible. If we think about the art world as an ecosystem, it needs everything. It needs the small spaces, it needs the bigger spaces, and the problem at the moment is that the weaker part of it is it feels fragile and needs support. And this is where, how do we instill, as you say, these young tech entrepreneurs to come in and feel a sense of kind of a duty, maybe? But the problem again, I think, it's that if you have a small ecosystem, how do you create awareness? How do you I mean, as an entrepreneur, as a tech entrepreneur, why would you choose art? Why don't you choose children, education, poverty, whatever it is? Why art? And I think that in the West, we take almost kind of for granted maybe that, you have massive museums and you have massive infrastructure and you need to support them. And I don't think India maybe is not at that awareness is not there yet, or the engagement is not there yet. But that maybe is something that needs to, it's not going to happen overnight, but maybe happen in the future.
Yeah, and that's something that Lekha said in response to the last question, which was, the education system needs to be, creating that sort of, very young, excited environment, or young and exciting environment around art at school, and then it rolls up from there. Lekha, any perspectives on how you shift this percentage that Anders has spotted as 62% and get more money flowing to those that don't necessarily trade their art at huge values?
Well, unfortunately, the big sales that happen are through auctions. And for the moment, people are still concentrating on the modern artist or the artists who have died. And those really take away big ticket, sort of numbers that Anders was talking about. Contemporary artists, I think at this moment, especially the ones who were established artists who came into their own in around 2000 and have been there now for 20 years, I think their market has slowed down considerably. Young galleries are actually working with younger artists, and those younger artists, I think, are getting a better platform. I'm not saying that their prices are higher or any such thing, but there is a group of young artists who are now getting recognized. So that, of course, but I think, yes, the basic problem is that, if there is going to be no funding for it, it leaves individuals, as Anders said, and that's not enough. That's really not enough.
Yeah, in many ways, there ought to be a sort of a cross subsidy, a taxation on those that trade art at very high values that is somehow recycled back to grassroots level, individual galleries and individual artists. I think it's a lovely idea, and it's not a new one, but quite hard to systematize that in a way that's fair, because it's effectively an indirect taxation, in fact, which on the successful. But one of the things we've been frustrated with in Oxford in the lockdown is the fact that museums aren't open, so you can't even convene people. And for philanthropy, when we have all our fundraisers running around, you want to be able to convene. You want to be able to convene in the Ashmolean and convene. Frankly, people love to come and just see the Radcliffe camera. And for the last 9 months, we haven't been able to do that. So actually, getting philanthropists engaged has been new philanthropists, at least, has been challenging. But another question I had for you was around the international appeal of Indian art and how you can make it more international, such that you can attract what I would call as a business person, foreign direct investment into India, directly into the sector from international sources. So how would you drive because I look at your report, Anders, and see lots and lots of Indian philanthropists funding the arts in India, but I don't see many folk from outside of India coming with money to fund art and young artists in India. And so question to you both on that, maybe Anders, to you first. How would you drive that sort of activity more?
But I guess it's maybe a little bit to do with the maturity of the market, so maturity of the ecosystem. I guess philanthropy has to, you will have to have some kind of affiliation, I guess, with the country or with the region in order to kind of want. I mean, if you're an art philanthropist, you might do it closer to home. You might support your local museum. I think also people who support, I guess, internationally in India would do this again on more humanitarian issues that are more pressing potentially than art. And I think, the challenge of getting foreign private donations into India, I think that might be quite a tall task. I mean, at the moment, obviously, there is also tightening regulations regarding foreign contributions with regards to the new amendment to the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which prevents the likes of Goethe Institute or to fund an organization and that organization then to sub-fund to smaller grassroots organizations. So that now there's also a regulatory bureaucracy that has put a kind of a bit of a spanner in the wheels regarding taking a specific foundation, for example, and that the ability for that foundation then to support smaller organizations across India, smaller arts organization, cultural organization is now becoming either impossible or very, very difficult. So I think there's now a kind of a legal or there's an element there which I think make this harder, much harder than it has been in the past. But I think I'm not sure if that's the way to go. I feel that India itself has an incredible resource. It has an incredible culture. It has incredible people. It's more whether we can, how do we encourage, multiply individuals like Lekha times 1,000, how do we, because there are people that has the means to do that, how can we instill that sense of pride and engagement in art? Because but it comes back a little bit again, I think what Lekha mentioned earlier, that if you don't embed art into the educational structure, how can you expect people 30 years down the line to take an interest in art, which if you never had kind of been part of your life from the beginning? I think, obviously some by accident will happen to engage with art at a later point in life, but there are so many other, as we talked about earlier, pressing needs that can be, or should be probably addressed prior to art. So I think that this is something that's going to have to start much earlier. It's going to start, and it might take 20 years before we come to a point.
It would definitely be it's a generational change, no doubt about that. I can tell you, one way to attract capital in from outside is, and we do this all over the university, is matching.
Yeah.
Because most donors love a deal, right? They're usually, if they're a corporate, they love a deal. If they're a foundation, they love a deal. If they're a high net worth, they love a deal. So if you can match funding on a 50-50 basis or even more attractive than that, then that will just suck in capital pretty quickly into the sector. At least that's my experience from.
But match from a government, do you mean a government?
Match from government, or you could take Lekha's idea around some of that CSR spend and say some of that CSR spend is carved out and is only available if it's on a match basis from so it doesn't have to be international, but it's just another way to bring extra capital into the sector. But Lekha, what are your thoughts on how to internationalize all this a bit more and get more capital flowing?
I don't know. I really don't know about that. But I think I think the funny thing is that, in India, everybody sort of looks at international organizations. And when Indian art is more, when they suddenly start to look at art in international museums or something like that, they come back home excited. So I'm also part of the Tate allocation team for South Asian art. And we constantly keep talking about this. And yes, there's been a huge over the past 7 years, we've made major collection of South Asian art at the Tate. And we're hoping that they will show that more often in the gallery space, which will possibly, when people go from India and see it and say, oh, okay, this is an Indian artist, why can't we sort of get this on our walls as well? I mean, maybe that is one way, but but I think the only way really to take this whole thing forward is first starting in India itself, as Anders said, there can be a lot of funding available. I don't think that should be a criteria. There should be really no shortage of funds, because large corporations have to give away 2% of their profit. So,
and do either of you know the breakdown of funding today as to where it's come from? Corporates, government, high net worth foundations. Do either of you know what that looks like? I mean, I suspect the data is very imperfect, but just anecdotally, is it zero government and 70% individual? I mean, how's the sector funded today?
We did again, it's very hard to find the figures, but we did a survey among the not-for-profits in arts organizations in India, and we found 16% was business. I think was under 5% was say they came from government sources, and the rest was private. So we're talking, even the corporate sector being a massive, many of the world's largest companies are in India. There's still a very modest, I think in 2018, $38 million was given to the arts and culture, which is a tiny amount if you think about the country as a whole. So, the US had I can't remember, if I look here, there's 20 billion they gave private investment. So in a sense, it's such a small sector, and I think it comes back to this thing of priority. I mean, the arts and culture and heritage was kind of shoehorned onto the CSR agenda when it was launched, and they sort of barely got it in, which I think it shows also the kind of priorities that the government also kind of, I guess, looks at when it comes to arts and culture in terms of supporting it. And obviously you've got to have, I think in these cases, whether it's matching schemes or whether it's coming from government sources or corporate, it has to be kind of led by someone. And I think, there needs to be a proactive sense from the government side to support art and culture. Otherwise, no one else, I don't think, will feel the obligation to do so. So
that's a really good point. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and of course, in the United Kingdom, we're blessed with all these museums who have a natural, local, lateral sort of convening power to make those arguments of how important, our arts are to the country.
And then you see, I guess, the government put up 1.57 billion for a rescue fund during COVID. I mean, these things, and other European governments has done the same. So we are in a very sort of luxurious position here.
Yeah, and the pandemic, we haven't really talked too much about the pandemic and its impact, but it's obviously very, very significant. And one of the features we've seen in Philanthropy in Oxford is it's been very easy to engage with existing donors. In fact, we've had record years, and especially around all the sciencey stuff being done around the vaccine. But existing donors are in fact more accessible than normal because they're all available at their homes online. New donors, that convening thing of getting them to the Ashmolean and having them meet Mallica and the other academics, that's really, you can't do it. So it's really hard to engage new donors. But listen, we've got quite a few questions flowing in on the chat in front of me here. So actually, I'm going to go back to something Lekha said early on. And it just did occur to me as a good question too, which is, how do you change government policy in the arts and education in India? How would you go about doing something like that in an Indian context?
I mean, for that, you need really a good lobbyist, who would help you do that. But from what I understand is that at least the government of Delhi has instituted a committee of about 17 or 18 artists or artist-led organizations or experts in their fields who have to produce a report within, I think now, about the next week or 10 days. which is going to bring in a comprehensive policy of culture and education in Delhi itself. If that happens, it'll be a great move forward, because that means that the government is taking an initiative, and then, others can piggyback on that, I think. I think but otherwise it has to be really major lobbying, and it can't be lobbying just by the arts community. It has to be lobbying through the corporate sector.
I think just on that
sorry,
point, I think also the examples that Lekha mentioned, the Museum of Art and Photography and Lekha Poddar, and you also need people to set examples. I think if you're starting to see these things potentially work, the models work, I think that will also encourage. I guess as I said, the maturity of the market is still a nascent market until you get the kind of track record for people showing that it's actually possible. Then it's also difficult to get that kind of momentum. But I think, as soon as some of these projects comes off the ground and can show people that it's actually possible, I feel that there might be other people coming out of the wood say, well, we can do something similar. And so these best practices hopefully will lead as examples also, hopefully for the future.
Yeah, I mean, that maturity point is incredibly important. And that's why maybe with Lekha's person in Bangalore, the tech entrepreneur who's set up his own gallery and who's dragging everybody along. I mean, surely some sort of digital showcasing of that as an example, which is, you sort of create the notion of followership behind people like that who kind of really do lead from the front and encourage others to do the same.
So Robert, sorry, he's not a tech entrepreneur. He's a collector.
Okay.
Who was just mentioned by Anders, and he's opening a museum of art and photography next week.
Terrific. Well, I mean, the one way to make things mature faster, because maturity unfortunately takes time, but if you can advance it, then you advance it by creating great examples, anecdotes, case studies of people who have done it very successfully, and showing impact with some good numbers back to the data, which is, how many artists have been promoted up through this particular gallery or this particular scheme. But Lekha, someone else on the chat here wants your views on the museums again, which I think is a good question, which is, how well funded are they and supported by government? I mean, what's the trend in government funding of museums?
Nothing as far as I know. It's whatever the normal budgetary expenses. But we've got a new Secretary of Culture who's very proactive and is really a museums person. So let's wait and watch, because he was appointed only during this COVID time, and museums have opened in India only last week or 2 weeks ago. So we'll have to see what kind of policies he can, sort of muster in through the government. But otherwise, there's nothing. Even the national museums are totally underfunded. There are no heads of departments. I don't know who's the director of the National Museum anymore, because the last one's term got over, and who's now been appointed the cultural secretary, who was the head of the National Museum, and now he's become the secretary. So I don't know if there's a director even. Wow.
That's amazing. Well, I mean, again, by comparison to the UK, we do have these terrific people, and not just executives. We have fantastic trustee boards of museums, Ashmolean, of course, but all across London too. Yeah, well, that's slightly depressing, but yeah, I mean, there must be a way to move it on. So going back to the chat here, here's another source of funding we haven't talked about. So I'll read the whole question. And see what you both think. I certainly have ideas. So the question is, I am presently head of policy at a fintech. What are your thoughts regarding initiating new microfinance structures, fintech faster payments, whereby wealthy entrepreneurs can donate easily to local artists, supporting local community and structures? So this is sort of crowdfunding made really convenient, where you use digital channels to get artists in front of folk that might want to fund them on a sort of mass market basis. Any thoughts on that? Because that's a whole new source of funding we haven't really talked about.
Well, I think it's a wonderful idea. I think and this is a little bit we've done quite a lot of work in the intersection between I guess philanthropy and technology, and I think, and also in the arts. I mean, there's some great examples out there also of there's an American company called Patreon, which is it allows creatives to create their own membership schemes. So it's a bit like a museum membership, but instead of supporting a museum, you're supporting a creative, an artist, a podcaster, a filmmaker, whatever it is, with regular monthly income. So the micropayments is maybe $5 and $5 a month. And obviously, if you have it building a little bit on the kind of basis of social media and followers, but in order not only following and liking you kind of suddenly just giving smaller payments. But if you multiply that times 100,000, then suddenly obviously it's going to be quite a lot of money coming in to support art. So I think there's a lot of very interesting potential models in that where technology can be used a little bit. We talked about Robert, the redistribution. Is there a way to we see more and more online sales? I mean, sales in online has obviously, because of the art market, has been incapable or prevented or restricted from doing anything in the physical world. Everything is now virtually online. Sotheby's, Christie's and Phillips had almost 300% increase in online sales over the last 8 months. I think this people are starting to buy more online. I mean, I think there will also be interesting ways of starting to think about payment, whether people could then at the checkout say, I want to support that specific organization, click this button, £5 goes this way. I mean, I think the art world needs to start to think this way, because I think there's huge opportunities, particularly among, again, younger individuals. We feel we did a survey a few months ago to try to feel why are people involved in the art at the moment. One is very strong, obviously, a personal and emotional engagement. The other thing is helping. It's a compassion, kind of almost like we want to support art, because we know that if we don't, we might be in an equally kind of dark place as we've been over the last eight months. So I think there's opportunities there, real opportunities, that the tech sector, maybe with the art sector. Unfortunately, the art sector is just a little bit sometimes traditional, maybe doesn't have the resources, and the tech sector kind of maybe feel too far away. But I think if those two worlds could come together, I think something amazing could potentially happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole digitization of this is, and it's not just the transmission of money,
no.
It's the transmission of content, which is the art itself. Because what might attract someone to a philanthropist to someone's site is more than likely is going to be the person's content, and maybe they do support the person as a consequence. So, but that does take investment, but not very much investment to create those channels. But Lekha, any thoughts on that? The whole microfinance question and how to get mass market funding into the sector.
It's happening in India also in a very small way. About a month and a half ago, I got an email to say that there was a young boy who was son of an auto rickshaw driver, who somehow in his government school had met someone from England who was a ballet teacher. This young boy, who was then 12, 13, studied ballet under this teacher, and how he did it, I don't know. But ultimately, all that I know is that he got a scholarship into the English National Ballet School. And he obviously didn't have money to support himself being in England for 2 years or 3 years for whatever their scholarship run was. And they did crowdfunding. And he's, I think, in England now. So very small things are happening. I got an email this afternoon to say that, there's how do we support the living traditions community or the vernacular community? So small crowdfunding is starting to happen for them, that, if we can give them money on a regular basis, at least for the next couple of months, and let's see what happens. And I guess they will choose 20, 30 artists. So in a very, very small way, it's starting. But yes, if we could really sort of take this forward, it will really make a huge difference. Because as Andy said, people would be very happy to give that £5, which turns into 500 rupees in India, which people will not be scared of donating.
Mm.
I think that's really a way forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can almost take this offline, but I mean, the mechanics of how you do that is, and maybe the person on the call who asked the question can help us with this. But the mechanics of how you do it is you have to make sure that the artist in question has a very basic tool set on how to set themselves up, because we can't do it for them. They have to do it themselves and set themselves up with some sort of a website that will attract traffic and have the tools that they can use to attract the traffic to their site.
But Robert, you'd be surprised in India now, every artist, whether he's even sitting in his village, has a small website.
Yeah, so it's how do you drive the traffic, right?
Yeah.
That's the key.
Yeah.
It's the traffic that will drive the micro payments.
Yeah.
And you've got to design your sites and all your interfaces to be able to make that happen.
Yeah.
There's a few questions on the chat, which I think we sort of covered already, around just how generous people are in India. So I think we've more or less covered that already. What about the other way? Someone's asked a question about the other way, money flowing from India and Pakistan to the UK. So the question is, do Indian or Pakistani philanthropists support art in the UK? How can they be encouraged to give? So the other way, how do you see that happening, or is it not?
So we have the South Asians Acquisition Committee at the Tate, and it's basically the committee members are all from India, Pakistan, and the subcontinent, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Mm. So we sort of really give a yearly membership to be part of this committee, and the funds raised from that supports the art that is for Tate.
Oh, that's really neat. So you get you pay. It's like a club. You pay to get on the committee. Your money's philanthropic, and it attracts out from outside the UK, from India into the Tate. Okay. And do the other museums have the same setup, Lekha? I never knew that.
Not that I know of.
Okay, that's neat. Okay. And does any experience of that? How to get money flowing the other way?
No, I don't really. Besides what Lekha already kind of mentioned within the art world, I guess again, if you are based in India, I again just think people will see this as why support what in their perception might be a wealthy Western institution when we hardly can support our own. And I think that might just not. It comes back to that. I think there's just so many other causes that they might then say, okay, if we're going to put money towards something, let's do that at home before we start supporting the way. I mean, it happens on probably on some scale. But Robert, what in your case? I mean, when you looked at university from an Oxford perspective, how did you see that flowing in academic context?
In an academic context, it's across the board. What you'll get is philanthropists from India, for example, wanting to bring money to Oxford for Indian scholars. So they'll, and that could be graduates, could be undergraduates, but they'll want to fund education. Out of India, less so on research. Where the people come to Oxford with money with the aim of doing research on a topic that is important in their home country. So very often you'll have that tie back to the home country. And of course, with the scholars, the donors often say, well, I want all my scholars to come back to Nigeria or back to India or back to Thailand once they've studied in Oxford. And that becomes a requirement of the scholarship. We can't do that. We have to obviously let people be free. But it's a complicated mix of things across Oxford. I'm conscious we're out of time. So I think we've touched on lots of interesting things, especially on the methods, how you would practically go about getting more funding. And we talked about digital, we've talked about corporate, and we've talked about government. And that, I think, is a good moment to pause and hand back to Mallica to close us up for the webinar.
Thank you. This conversation has given us all much to contemplate and reflect on. Our speakers mentioned the impact of the pandemic. Recent studies, I just want to add, by the UNESCO and the International Council of Museums confirm that art institutes have been especially affected by the pandemic. Nearly 90% of museums across the world have closed during the crisis, and 13%, we are told, of these museums may never reopen their doors. This might be a serious and concerning potential reality in our near future. Several other thoughts put together here, really, really interesting. I think if the practice of philanthropy stems from the belief that people can make a difference and the satisfaction that philanthropists receive in changing lives for the better, I hope institutions which can enable the growth of philanthropy will be supported generously as the need grows exponentially in the near future. With that, we end the formal proceedings for today. It just leaves for me to thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you also to Avni and Premjeet for all the work done behind the scenes. And above all, on behalf of the India Oxford Initiative and all my colleagues, many thanks, Lekha, Anders, and Robert, for sharing so generously your thoughts and time with us today. Many thanks.
Thank you, Mallica.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.